Hello, Heather Walker here. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all about my research project. As long as I can remember, I have been fascinated with the history of small mountain towns throughout the West, particularly mining towns in Colorado. Whether I am driving through to go camping or skiing or for my husband's job, we frequent towns like this often. You walk on the wood boardwalk, you look at the intact structures, you look at those magical historical plaques on the buildings that tell you if it was a general store or a saloon or the bank. I've always wondered who came to these towns to bring the gospel message. Who came to these towns to plant the first church? Who came to these towns to serve the poor and the needy? This research project in this class gave me the opportunity to look into some of those questions. As Americans migrated into the area of Colorado and the Intermountain West, the desire for religion was evident. The roots of Protestant influence took hold and brought about development in ways that mirrored the counterparts on the East Coast and stood in very stark contrast. My thesis argues that the Protestant evangelists played a very significant role in developing towns in the Rocky Mountain West. I've divided my paper into 3 parts. The first part looks at who answered the call. The second part, rocky ground or fertile soil, looks at what happened with the ministers in the towns. And then the third part looks at the legacy. So in answering the call, it's important to understand the context here. This is post-Civil War, primarily is the time frame I'm looking at. But in going back and looking at the Second Great Awakening, looking at the legacy of itinerant preachers on horseback in the Methodist Church, excuse me, and looking at revival tent meetings and gatherings and the way that this transformed the West that was still east of the Mississippi River. Then as Americans with manifest destinies start heading even further west, this landscape, it might as well have been Moses leading people to the promised land, right? You have Mormon migration, you have gold being discovered in California, and then my area of interest here, looking at the Rocky Mountains and looking at Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and looking at the mining towns and the railroad towns in the Rocky Mountains. So who were these ministers? They were assigned by boards and committees to frontier sites to plant a church. Were they do-gooders? Were they misfits? Were they adventurers? The only evidence we have are the stories and the writings they left behind. And to those questions, I would say yes. If we have evidence of all the types. And so these missionaries, these evangelists, these pioneer evangelists really were the foremost representatives of culture on the new frontier. In my research, I look at denominational reports. It was a very important part of my study in looking at how certain churches backed certain regions and certain movements. And you can see that. It's also important to note that a lot of these home missionary organizations sponsored evangelism to the indigenous people, and their focus was primarily the American Indians in Colorado and Arizona, and how 2 separate worlds, right? Both channeling resources and funding, but very separate in terms of where their message was going. So, was it rocky ground or was it fertile soil? In order to evaluate that, you really have to look at the sources, and I found sources that support both. I found a journal of a young miner. He was 29 years old when he began his trek to Colorado, and his diary entries reveal his loneliness and the hardships, and he missed his wife and children so much. And the church in his town outside of Leadville, Colorado, offered to him a routine. He would go there on the Sabbath, and it would remind him of his family back east. He has a quote, a line in the journal that I quote, where he said, "You can look around and see the tears on these rustic cheeks," right? And the fact that churches were there in these towns on the frontier brought a sense of home to these miners. Another source looked at a small town outside of Gunnison, Colorado, There's 23 saloons and only one church. And in this news article, the writer is begging the Methodist Church, please come. You go all over the ends of the earth, but we have 5,000 people in this town, and you have yet to come. And it ends with the line, Methodists, you should wake up. I found that one quite entertaining. So these ministers, some were not successful. It was a life of poverty and hardship. A lot of times, if their wives came with them, they didn't last maybe 2-3 years at the most. The pressure put on by these sponsoring organizations and mission groups, if you didn't perform with numbers and attendees, the pressure became overwhelming. So overall, we know that the evangelists and the frontier had significant influence upon each other. It was mutual. We see that the ministers in these towns create around them the moral compass for politics, for the economic activities, for culturally diverse enterprises. We see this. We see the church becoming a draw that just increases the population of the town. And overall, the role of these ministers went beyond the pulpit. It is evident. They set up schools. It was the social welfare that was resting on these shoulders. So they were rugged. They were unconventional. And they had a deep calling to go and to serve. Some of these mountain towns can trace the lineage of their churches today to these very first ministers, which I just thought was so cool. While others are literally ghost towns. So, hope you enjoyed hearing about my project. Thank you very much.